Good evening and welcome to our second presentation as a part of our seminar series. We would like to welcome all of you and thank you for being here. I'm going to turn the program. My name is Fatima Malekian and I am the project director for Center of Excellence for Nutrition, Health, Wellness, and Quality of Life. With that said, I'm going to turn the program to Dr. Norma Dawkins from Tuskegee University to say the welcome for the program. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Norma Dawkins, professor and chair of the Department of Food and Nutritional Sciences, and I am one of the high on the project, which is the Center of Excellence for Nutrition, Health, Wellness, and Quality of Life at Southern University Agricultural Research and Extension Center. In July of 2021, the United States Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Agriculture, awarded $1.768 million grant to Southern University, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Tuskegee University, and the 1819 Foundation under the Center of Excellence to support the triple land grant mission of research, teaching, as well as extension to contribute solutions to improve the health and well-being of underserved and minority populations. To know more about the center, you can visit www.suagcenter.com and you will find more information about the center. So on behalf of our Chancellor at Southern University and A&M College, Dean Dr. Orlando McMeans, and the Center of Excellence team, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to part 2 of our webinar series focusing on the role of translational research in diet-related disparities. The webinar series is one of the programs under the Center of Excellence. During the presentation, please place your questions in the question and answer tab to utilize the chat features. And again, I just want to say welcome to our second symposium. I hope you had enjoyed the first one, and I am anticipating that you are excited to hear what will be shared in the second presentation. And so without further ado, I will now turn the introduction of the speaker to Miss Blessing Abibama, graduate students at Tuskegee University. Blessing, you're on.
Thank you, Dr. Dawkins. Good evening, everyone. My name is Blessing Abibama. I'm a student here at Tuskegee University, and it's been my pleasure to read the bio of Dr. Shikany. Dr. James M. Shikany is the Obamian Endowed Professor of Cardiovascular Disease and Associate Director for Research in the Division of Preventive Medicine, School of Medicine, University of Alabama at Birmingham. He arrived at UAB in 1993 after earning a public health doctorate with a specialization in nutrition from the UCLA School of Public Health. Besides his primary appointment in the Division of Preventive Medicine, Dr. Shikany has a secondary appointment in the Department of Epidemiology at the UAB School of Public Health. He's a senior scientist in the Comprehensive Diabetic Center, Comprehensive Center for Healthy Aging, Comprehensive Cancer Center, and Minority Health and Health Disparity Research Center. He is a scientist in the Comprehensive Cardiovascular Center and Center for Exercise Medicine, and is an associate scientist in the Nutrition Obesity Research Center at UAB. Dr. Shikany's professional effort has been in the areas of epidemiology and clinical research. His research interests are wide-ranging, but center on the association of diet and chronic disease. including cancer and cardiovascular disease. He has current and previous research funding from the National Institute of Health, Department of Defense, American Heart Association, and the American Cancer Society. My pleasure to introduce him. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm always uncomfortable sitting through introductions, but I realize they have to be done, but thank you. So first I'll ask if, first of all, good evening to everybody. I hope, is the volume okay? Okay. I hope that this will be an informative presentation. The title, there was a little controversy about that. I've kind of changed it just a tad. I'm going to start my slides in just a minute. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. So let me go ahead and see if I can share my slides. This is always fun. Let's see. So is everybody seeing those okay?
Yes, they're clear.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the title that was kind of, I won't say assigned, but it was kind of, you can see there, I've altered it just a tad. I'm not a bench researcher. I'm basically a nutritional epidemiologist. So I'm going to present an analysis, a study that we did, actually led to 3 papers. I'm going to concentrate on the first one. And then I'm going to talk, that's where a regular presentation of mine would end, but we're going to move past the finding to try to figure out how, or at least discuss how we can actually translate that into dietary changes, especially in under-resourced populations. So again, we'll kind of go through the more of a traditional presentation, and then I'm going to talk more about, well, what do we do with this? So coronary heart disease is still a very important cause of mortality in the US. About 1 of every 8 deaths is due to, basically called heart disease. And that's over 360,000 deaths in 2019. So it's still a major problem. And, however, mortality decreased somewhat in the decade, starting this century for about the first 10 years or so. And actually, if you go back further, looking at this graph here, you can see going back 40 years or so, mortality has really gone down. In the last 10 years or so, things have kind of leveled off, which is a little bit troubling. But I think the main thing here is not all groups have benefited equally. As you can see here, the dotted line for white males actually started off with the highest mortality about 40 years ago. But you can see that white men have had kind of a compared to Black men, more of a decrease in mortality. So now Black men have a mortality rate that's higher than white men. So they have not benefited to the extent that white men have. And we see these kind of disparities despite efforts to address them. And I know you're all certainly aware of those efforts. They're still around, and that's disappointing to be, I've been doing research about 30 years now, to still see some of these disparities exist. It's disappointing. And just to give you a few more details on this, looking at 4 groups, white and Black males and white and Black females, you can see no matter what the age group, that Black males and then the second highest Black females when it comes to the incidence of myocardial infarction or fatal CHD in general. The disparities increase as people get older, as you'll see here. And just a little more details here. You can just looking at some numbers, just some people have a little easier time making comparisons when they can see numbers. So you can see again, the Black males are leading as far as incidence of MI, no matter what age group you look at, with Black females being second. So I'm sure you're aware of the documented risk factors for CHD, but I'll just review those briefly. Cigarette smoking, certainly the biggest risk factor, dyslipidemia, diabetes, high blood pressure, being overweight or obese, and being physically inactive. Now, the thing I'm interested in diet certainly influences the development of CHD, likely through its effects on several of these things. You can see a clear association with most of the things on this list. And if you look at the age-adjusted prevalence estimates of poor, intermediate, and ideal cardiovascular health, if you look at the healthy diet score where the red arrow is, you can see non-Hispanic Blacks have more than 80% poor, or in the poor category as far as scores, and fewer than 20% intermediate, and none in the ideal. So it's a problem. It's a problem for just about everybody. If you look there, nobody's doing really well, but Blacks have a particular problem here as far as diet quality. And just looking at some specifics there, I've just picked out a few of these fruits and vegetables, and you can see non-Hispanic Blacks there in the light gray generally are fairly low consumers of fruits and vegetables. The next one for sugar sweetened beverages, they tend to be higher consumers. And then going back to the beneficial things, in this case, whole grains, relatively low consumers. So those are just three of the things that make up that healthy diet score. So we've done a lot of research looking at individual foods and nutrients in relation to CHD risk, things like red meat, saturated fat. When I first started in this business, that's kind of the way we did things, is looking at individual dietary components. But the relationship between overall diet and CHD may be more informative because after all, foods are consumed together, not in isolation. So there's been a recent trend, I mean at least the last 10 years or so, to derive dietary patterns to study diet disease associations. And one of the methods for doing that is factor analysis. And it's a data-driven approach. We use collected dietary data. There's no preconceived judgments about which foods are consumed together or what patterns make sense. It's really derived from the collected dietary data, whether that be from a food frequency questionnaire, which is a lot of what I do, or some other method. And factor analysis has been used in previous studies of dietary patterns and CHD risk, but studies in a large US sample with socio-demographic and regional diversity have really been lacking. So I decided I've been associated with the REGARD study, and that's the Reasons for Geographic and Racial Differences in Stroke study. Been involved with it for quite some time. It's a large cohort study that was established almost 20 years ago. And it was designed to identify factors that increase the risk of stroke in Black persons and those residing in the southern US. There's a stroke belt in the Southeast and a buckle area. I'll give you those states in just a minute, where stroke is a particular problem. And we also know that stroke is a particular problem in Black persons compared to some other groups. REGARDS has a regionally and socioeconomically diverse sample, pretty equal numbers of men and women, and a fairly high proportion of Black participants, which, that was certainly intentional. They've been underrepresented in studies, so that was one of the goals of REGARDS. And REGARDS has included comprehensive assessment of diet, socio-demographic factors, and anthropometric measures at baseline. We've had follow-up measures since then, but they were participants are very completely characterized at baseline. Dietary patterns have been previously derived in REGARDS. We did that several years ago, and others have then related those patterns to incidence of stroke, mortality and chronic kidney disease, risk of sepsis, and socioeconomic status. There's a REGARDS ancillary study that I've also been involved with called REGARDS myocardial infarction, or REGARDS MI. And it's a study that is particularly interested in coronary heart disease. So I think it's a good complement to the stroke study. And it includes a rigorous ascertainment of acute CHD outcomes. All cases are adjudicated. They're not just self-report. I think that's important. So our hypothesis was that dietary patterns empirically derived using factor analysis would be associated with the risk of incident acute CHD in REGARDS participants, and in particular participants who were free of CHD to the best of our knowledge at baseline. So the design and methods of the regards study in general have been well described, and there's a reference here for those that are interested. It's a national population-based longitudinal cohort of just over 30,000 community dwelling Black and white women and men of at least age 45 years. Participants were recruited starting in 2003, and that went for about 4 years through 2007. And participants came from commercially available lists of US residents. And you can see how the recruitment was distributed, about 30% from the stroke belt. And you can see the states here that are included in the so-called stroke belt, 20% from the stroke buckle, and that's a particular area of particular high incidence of stroke, and that's the coastal plains of North and South Carolina and Georgia. And then 50% from elsewhere in the continental US, from areas that don't have a particularly high incidence of stroke. The inclusion criteria are basically having a name, telephone number, and address in the available database from which the samples was selected, and as I said, being at least 45. People who are a race other than Black or white were excluded. If you're being actively treated for cancer or had other serious medical conditions, were cognitively impaired, were in a nursing home or other institutional setting, or could not communicate in English, you were excluded. And so the baseline cohort in regards was 42% Black and 55% women. There was an initial telephone interview to survey participants and establish that they were in fact eligible. And then computer-assisted telephone interviews were done to collect demographic information, medical history, and then participants were visited in their homes for physical measurements, height, weight, waist circumference, things like that, medication inventory, have an ECG done, and then blood and urine collected. Now, for dietary assessment, which is, of course, what I'm interested in, I know a lot of you are interested in, we use the food frequency questionnaire, in this case, the Block 98 FFQ. This has been validated in other studies, and a limitation of this study is that it has not been validated specifically in regards, but we feel pretty comfortable that it performed well. And it asked about the usual intake of 110 food items over the previous year. It had 9 possible frequencies of consumption ranging from never to every day. And it made an attempt to quantify the amount of foods consumed, and that could be by asking for number for things like eggs, or a portion size for something like spaghetti. And they photograph pictures with standard portion sizes were included. And then there were a few adjustment questions, like if you said, did you consume milk, it would ask about the type of milk, full fat, low fat, etc. The FFQ was self-administered after the in-home visit, and participants filled it out after the study staff left. And then it was mailed to the Regards Operations Center, where it was checked for completeness and then scanned. And then it was forwarded to the Nutrition Quest, and that's the block group in Berkeley, California, who do all the analyses, supply the FFQs in, and also analyze them. And basically the amounts of each food consumed were calculated by multiplying the frequency of consumption by the usual amount consumed. Now, to derive patterns, you first have to establish food groups. And we did that about 6 years ago, as you can see, and published that method. So for those that are interested in the method that we used, you can refer to that publication. But we established or constructed the food groups using the 110 individual food variables. And we constructed groups based on culinary use, nutrient similarities between the foods, and also using the review of the literature. What did previous studies do? Never, it's always, if you don't have to reinvent the wheel, it's always best not to. And we also considered the nutritional content, cooking method, and how's the particular food item used. And we attempted to separate groups to differentiate more and less healthy alternatives for similar foods. Like there may be, like milk, for example, a high fat and low or no fat versions, and or which are very different, of course, nutritionally. And we separated fried and non-fried items because, again, something can be fairly healthy. Fish, as an example, when it's not fried, and frying, I think, kind of unfortunately takes over a little bit more to the non-healthy side of the spectrum. Some items were left as standalone groups because of the uniqueness of the items, such as Chinese food. We had multiple categories of vegetables, so we could try to preserve regional variability in vegetable intake. You can see the categories there. Coffee and tea were kept separate. And so initially we had 58 food groups. We did a couple of adjustments. Diet shakes, meal replacements were excluded because there just weren't that many of them consumed. And we moved breakfast power bars into the sweetened, I believe it's the sweetened breakfast foods category. So we ended up with 56 final groups on which the patterns were based. So we used, again, factor analysis, and we used a split sample. About 50% of the sample, we derived the dietary patterns by exploratory factor analysis, and then we tested them by confirmatory factor analysis in the other half. And the final number of factors retained, how many do we end up with? That was based on the eigenvalues as were visualized on the spree plot. And the solution that provided the optimal congruence across sex, race, and region was chosen. And because the coefficient of congruence was high, we calculated the final factor loadings using factor analysis with Varimax rotation of 5 factors on the full sample. So we ended up with a 5-factor solution. And we used all food groups in calculating the final score, regardless of how much or how little they loaded. And we named the patterns based on the main factor loadings. So here are our patterns. The first one being the convenience patterns. You can see there are mixed dishes, pasta dishes, pizza, Mexican food, Chinese food. And I'm starting to get hungry for dinner, and this picture is making me even hungrier. Plant-based, this would be what some people call the prudent or healthy dietary pattern that you might have seen in other studies. Vegetables, fruits, cereals, whole grains, fish, poultry, yogurt, things like that. Sweets, desserts, chocolate, candies, and there's the sweetened breakfast foods I had mentioned. And then here's the one I'm going to concentrate on, the Southern pattern. And again, added fats, fried foods, eggs and egg dishes, organ meats, processed meats, sugar sweetened beverages. Now, please remember that this is factor analysis. It doesn't mean that people only adhere to one of these patterns. Everyone adheres to all of these patterns, but to different degrees. So I might have a fairly high adherence, I try to do as I preach. So I might have a fairly high adherence to the plant-based pattern, but that doesn't mean I don't have some adherence to the Southern pattern. I may like, occasional egg or even occasional piece of, fried chicken, whatever. So I do have some level of adherence to this pattern as well. This isn't cluster analysis where you categorize a person into only one pattern. I think that's an important point that sometimes is missed. The final pattern is the alcohol and salad pattern, as one of my colleagues refers to this as the faculty dietary pattern, but this is all kinds of liquor and then green leafy vegetables and salad dressing. So again, for all these patterns, the foods I have shown are foods that loaded heavily in each of these patterns. Again, there are many other foods included, but they have much lower loadings. Excuse me. So as far as the outcome, incident CHD included non-fatal MI or acute CHD deaths, again, in people who didn't have CHD at baseline. We captured incident cases by participant report when possible. Participants in regards are contacted every 6 months to assess vital status. And when we suspected an event, we sent for medical records, and each case was adjudicated. Again, I think that's a real strength of this study, is that events were not just based on self-report, but were actually adjudicated based on signs and symptoms, enzymes, ECG changes, and so forth. And when there was an unfortunate occurrence of a death, and we talked with proxies and used death certificates and National Death Index to try to identify CHD as an underlying cause of death. So there were just over 24,000 participants free from CHD at baseline. We excluded those who are missing FFQs entirely. Those who didn't return them, obviously we couldn't use them. If someone had more than 50% missing data, they were excluded, or implausible energy intakes. So our final sample, as you can see, quite a few people were excluded based on us. So we had just over 17,000. And we grouped adherence to the 5 patterns into quartiles, with quartile 1 being the lowest adherence and quartile 4 the highest adherence to each pattern. And we used basic statistics for analysis, for our basic analysis, just looking at characteristics, chi-square for proportions, and ANOVA for continuous variables. We use Cox proportional hazards regression to examine the risk of incident acute CHD associated with adherence to each of the 5 dietary patterns. So that was the basic analysis, with the lowest quartile of adherence being the referent. The year since the study entry was a time metric, with participants censored at the date of incident CHD, date of withdrawal, date of death, or the end of 2013. This first analysis, the first paper, that's when that was done. We had 5 models in this first analysis, and you can see each one added some factors. The last couple papers I'll talk about in this series, we just used 2 basic models. But the basic model here that we used was model 4. So includes all the factors up into BMI, waist circumference. Those are things that we consider to be in a causal pathway. So we wanted to do additional models adding those things in, but model 4 was the model of interest here. So in this analysis of those 17,418, 59% women, 35% were Black, 56% were residents of the stroke belt. Now, as you can see, the percentage here of Blacks is lower than regards overall, because unfortunately, we had a higher proportion of participants who did not return FFQs were Black. So we just, we did the best we could getting those back, but still I think 35% was a pretty good effort. I would have liked it to be 50-50, but that's what we could do. So demographic, socioeconomic, lifestyle, and anthropometric, and medical history characteristics. We looked at all those across quartiles of adherence to each pattern, and we did the same for dietary variables. So we had 536 cases of incident acute CHD, adjudicated over a median of about 5.8 years. So looking at, I'm going to concentrate on the southern pattern, because as you'll see in the slide coming up here, that's the one where we really saw associations. For those who consumed, were the highest consumers or adhered highest to that pattern, there was a higher proportion of Black participants. This certainly does not mean that there were not white participants who were high adherers to that diet, but the proportion of Blacks increased as the quartiles went up to the highest quartile of consumption. We also see that education tended, as shown by not graduating from high school, tended to increase, smoking increased, being physically active decreased, some of the anthropometric measures worsened, and so did some of the medical conditions such as hypertension, dyslipidemia, and diabetes. All those things worsened with those who were higher consumers of the Southern dietary pattern. And looking at some of the dietary factors, we certainly saw higher energy intake in those who were higher consumers or adherers to that dietary pattern. Also increased higher fat intake, tended to be a little bit lower fiber and fruit and vegetable, but for some reason, never really figured this out, higher when it came to whole grains. That was a little bit of a surprising finding. So to the meat of this, and I'm just going to show this, the entire table first, and I'm going to concentrate on Southern. I just want to show you that none of the other patterns, if you look at the model 4, were significantly associated with the risk of CHD. That surprises some. It surprised me as far as the convenience. I expected to be positively associated. I expected the plant-based to be negatively associated, but they were not, and nothing significant with the sweets or alcohol and salads pattern either. It's really only the southern pattern. So let's just zoom in on that. And you can see for the Model 4, there was about a 56% higher risk of coronary heart disease in the highest quartile of adherence to that dietary pattern, with a highly significant P for trend. And you can look here, the probability of acute CHD-free survival, and this is looking at just the quartile, the highest adherence quartile for the various patterns. You can see the CHD survival is in fact worse for the southern pattern, significantly worse compared to the other 4 patterns. The second paper, and I'm just going to briefly just go over the findings. We looked at, this came out in 2018, about 3 years later, dietary patterns and mortality. And again, we did not find anything significant in any of the patterns except for the southern pattern, where we found an approximately 57% higher risk of all-cause mortality in participants who were in the highest quartile of adherence to the southern pattern. The third analysis, which came out just a few months ago this year, again showed the southern pattern. Our P for trend was 0.06. I'm not so married to p-values that I consider that non-meaningful or non-important. We saw about a 46% higher risk of sudden cardiac death. This is a specific subcategory of CHD, so we kind of zeroed in on that one type, and that again we found a positive association with the southern dietary pattern. So that was the third paper in our kind of triumvirate of analyses we did based on these dietary patterns and heart disease in regards. Excuse me 1 second here. So just in conclusion for this part, the southern dietary pattern, which includes or loads heavily on added fats, fried foods, eggs and egg dishes, organ meats, processed meats, and sugar-sweetened beverages, was positively associated with the risk of incident acute CHD in this population-based sample of Black and white adults in the US. The southern pattern was also positively associated with risk of all-cause mortality, and there was a positive association of the southern pattern with risk of sudden cardiac death. Some potential mechanisms. It's funny, we kind of moved from looking at individual nutrients to patterns, but yet people always want still to try to find out, well, what is it about that pattern that may be responsible? I can't tell you what's responsible. I like to think it's a combination of things, but I can't tell you what any one factor that might be more important than other factors. But we do know that processed meats have been positively associated with CHD risk in other studies. They have a high sodium content, they have a high nitrate preservative content, and those along with their byproducts can promote atherosclerosis and vascular dysfunction. Sugar-sweetened beverages have been positively associated with CHD risk, certainly an adverse effect on body weight. They increase glycemic load, leading to insulin resistance, beta cell dysfunction, inflammation, which promote atherosclerosis. Added fats, I think it's important to note that the type of fat is really important, not necessarily the amount, with saturated fats being certainly unhealthier than unsaturated. And eggs, I think the jury's kind of still out on eggs. There's been plenty of studies showing that up to an egg a day really isn't associated with an increased risk of CHD. But when you go beyond that, there are quite a few studies showing an increased risk. So I'll leave it to you to try to decide what might be going on here. Again, I think one of the advantages of looking at patterns is, that's how people eat really. And I think I like to see people try to make changes to an overall pattern, not just say, well, I'm just not going to eat this one food anymore. Or if they find a food that they hear about as beneficial, then they're going to eat, 10 servings of that a day. I like a more balanced approach where people try to make changes over their entire diet. So as far as strength, this was a large population-based sample. It was fairly diverse, large proportion of Black participants and large proportion of participants from the stroke, belt, and buckle. We had a comprehensive assessment of diet, and we used a rigorous method, factor analysis, to derive dietary patterns. As I said, as far as limitations, the FFQ had not been validated in regards to cohorts specifically. There's always problems with recall diet. I mean, I have kind of the same standard boilerplate that goes in discussion of most of my papers about recall diet and self-reported diet. I think when the first paper came out, someone here at UAB, which I thought was kind of rude, wrote to the journal saying that the paper should be completely discounted because it was based on an FFQ. Well, FFQs have problems, but if they're used correctly and you acknowledge your limitations, I think they have value. They're not good for coming up with absolute intakes. They're not designed for that, but I think they're fine for ranking people along a continuum, and that's what I use them for. So I think if they're used properly, they're a valuable tool. And in a lot of our big cohorts, that's what we have. That's what's available. There could be selection bias from using commercially available lists for recruitment. Not all persons have a listed telephone number and mailing, especially anymore, but a mailing address. And can we generalize the results beyond white and Black persons in the US? I don't know, probably not. So the journal Circulation asked for a clinical perspective, and which I included. And I think this study does have clinical implications. Now, this is an observational study. It's not a clinical trial, so you have to be careful. But because it's a well-conducted, it doesn't sound very modest, but I think we did a good job with it. And I think it's perfectly okay to issue advice or recommendations based on a well-conducted observational study if there are no risks involved. And to my knowledge, there's no risk involved at advising people to maybe reduce their fats and fried foods and sugar-sweetened beverages. And it may benefit them. I can't tell you for sure because it is observational in nature. But for something that has low risk, I think it's perfectly good. And I think I would be irresponsible not to make some, issue some advice regarding that. As I say in the last sentence here, there's no known risk associated with your recommendations, and they may favorably influence the hazard or risk of acute coronary heart disease. So I'm feeling pretty good when this came out. It was in a high profile journal, Circulation. It's probably the highest impact factor journal I've ever had a nutrition paper in. My division leader likes to see high impact papers. The school of medicine likes it. And I got this email from AHA saying, it's just gotten incredible hits from the press. I did all kinds of interviews, which for any of those who know me, I'm basically a shy person. It was uncomfortable time for me, but I kind of got used to it. But and it had the largest readership of any AHA journal news release for at least the previous 3 years. So it just floored me. But people just this dietary pattern, I think the Southern pattern thing took off, and it was just incredible. So at this point, I'm thinking pretty good about things. I'm happy. What could be wrong? Well, this happened. After the third paper was published, I heard from this woman, Sean Chavis, who's the founder and CEO of Living Book, which is a health engagement startup that helps people to eat to prevent or manage chronic conditions in culturally appropriate ways. And she had some interesting comments. Some of them reflect just a misunderstanding of the design of the study, but I think they were still meaningful, important comments that I took to heart, and I responded to her. She wrote a letter to AHA and copied me, and I responded. I took a few days to think about things. I responded, but So her problems were that the description of the Southern diet reflects just a segment of what Southern food is, specifically the nutritionally indulgent foods that have been commercialized for profit. Well, what I don't think she realized, what I tried to explain to her, was that these were patterns derived from the dietary data. We did not sit down and put these patterns together. But I still think it was an interesting comment. And then she goes on to say there are several Black American cuisines, not one, and that the Southern food and Black American cuisines share common elements, but are not the same. I certainly agree with that. And she went into much detail about, depending on the region, differences in the cuisine. Again, I don't think, I think it just reflected a little bit of a misunderstanding of the design and how we assess diet. But again, an interesting comment. And then she said, are you using Southern to mean Black American in describing diet? No, we were not. Now, as I mentioned, Black Americans were more likely to adhere to a Southern diet, but plenty of white Americans also had a high adherence to that diet. Have you considered, and this was, I think, the comment that I'll say kind of hurt my feelings, because I never want to think what I'm doing is actually harming people. Who wants to think that? Have you considered the harm of a study that ultimately directs people to divorce themselves from their own food traditions and local food systems and gives care providers justification for doing the same? Or have you considered the power of showing people that they can find health right around them, that's inherent in their own cultural traditions and readily available in their local food systems and economies? So I think that's a really great comment. And I guess I didn't consider harm because, again, the patterns we looked at were derived from the dietary assessment instrument. We did not go into a community, for example, and say, you should stop eating this food or that food because it's harmful, and not even consider, nuances in their diets, the differences, whatever. That's not what we did. So again, I think her comments were very important. We tend to, at least I shouldn't say we, everybody, but I'll confess, sometimes we sit up here in our ivory towers and think, I'll just do my analyses and write my papers, and who cares what the consequences are. So I think it's good to have something like this happen. It makes you think. So this got me thinking about the implications of our research, and not only specifically about her comments, but also what do we do next? Because normally in a situation like this, I would say my job is over. I'm moving on to my next analysis. Because after all, it's the people who have to try to get people to make dietary changes that have the tough job, the behavioral people and others. My job is relatively easy because I can just say, here's what we feel is a healthy diet. But, trying to get people to make changes, that's the tough job, and one that I'm not usually involved in. So I thought I would carry this forward for the purpose of this presentation to think about that a little bit. And, what can we do about that? I'm just going to present a few things that I've thought about that, and most of them came from this paper that you can see the reference below there that I highly recommend, came out last year. So I think just a really helpful paper. In fact, I still have it sitting right here. And it's Barriers, Opportunities, and Challenges in Addressing Disparities in Diet-Related Cardiovascular Disease in the United States. So most of what I have in the next few slides came from this paper. So I want to be sure to credit the authors. But there's a lot of factors that we should consider when it comes to trying to get people to change their diet. So we know we have some idea what a healthy diet is. How can we get people to make changes? There's factors in the nutrition environment, economic factors, individual level factors. And what I think is really important, and what I've learned, one of the things I have learned since I've been in Alabama, which is, 28 years now, is, cultural factors are very important. So as far as the nutrition environment, unfortunately, we certainly still have racial segregation to different degrees depending on where you are, but that can lead to community disinvestment, adverse effects on the built environment, and that influences the quantity and quality of food stores that are available. Access to supermarkets and grocery stores that stock affordable, healthy foods is positively associated with diet quality. So if those stores are not available, that's a problem. Food deserts, areas are defined areas that lack access to affordable fruits, vegetables, whole grains, things that are generally are associated with a healthy diet. And the food deserts are disproportionately affect persons of low income, low educational attainment, and racial ethnic minorities. There's just no question about that. In low income census tracts, about 50% of the population has limited access to supermarkets or grocery stores. So those are some of the barriers that keep us from being able to improve diet quality. Interesting term in his paper, food swamps, areas with greater density of fast food outlets and convenience stores that generally have meager healthy food offerings. And I think the name came from the areas where the nutrient poor, energy dense food availability actually swamps the healthy food options, just overcomes them. And they are more common in low-income areas and communities with a high proportion of racial ethnic minorities. The availability, affordability, and quality of healthy foods are greater in supermarkets and grocery stores compared with fast food outlets and convenience stores. Again, we know this is true, but making changes, of course, is the tough part. Economic barriers, food insecurity, reduced quality, variety, or desirability of the foods and diets consumed with or without reduced food intake. That's a basic definition. Definition of low food security is there's generally when you see multiple indications of disrupted eating patterns and reduced food intake. Now, this is attributable to economic factors, certainly, and that includes the prices of foods, the income level, how much money you have to buy food, and of course, food availability and access. Food insecurity is associated with lower diet quality, no question about that. There's complex interactions among race, ethnicity, food insecurity, food assistance program participation, and diet quality. But the bottom line is that Black persons are more likely than white persons to be food insecure. And finally, as far as barriers, cultural factors. Dr. Dawkins and other colleagues at Tuskegee and I looked at some, I believe we were looking at just some dietary factors in the traditional Southern kind of diet. And this opened my eyes because, coming from Los Angeles and in Southern California, I wasn't aware of necessarily what's used to prepare certain foods. Pig's feet, ham hocks, you can see neck bones, and then, just different things that, and again, these are some of the things in a more traditional Southern diet, and I don't like to make generalizations, but my point is that there are different things that must be considered. Cultural factors should be considered. And then in this other paper, this other table I have here about the cultural appropriateness of health behaviors, again, there's other factors that one must consider. And I think of all the things in this table that is most meaningful to me is being overweight is healthy or not being concerned with the consequences of being overweight and obese. Now, when I came here, I thought, well, gosh, doesn't matter if you're Black or white or whatever. Certainly, you know that if you're overweight or obese, that's not healthy and it should be something you should strive to prevent. But I've learned, certainly got this through my hard head over the years, that not everybody views obesity and overweight the same. Some people don't view it as a major health problem. And I don't think anyone should ever be bullied or made to feel bad about their weight. But on the other hand, I do worry that if we go too much in the direction of normality regarding overweight, then we're really going to be fighting an uphill battle. We already are. Regarding some of these chronic diseases. So I notice a lot more overweight people in television commercials lately. I don't know if you've noticed that. And again, as far as inclusion and whatnot, I think that's a good thing. But I do worry a little bit about, again, it just being considered normal now. So I'd be interested in your comments. But again, my eyes certainly were opened by moving to a completely different part of the country that not everybody views things the way I do. And my ways are not necessarily the right ways. So we reviewed a few barriers and whatnot. What can we do to help improve diet quality? And you may all be very much aware of these, but I just thought it'd be good to point it out because I don't think all of them are taken advantage of. There's food assistance programs such as the SNAP program, WIC, which I'm sure you're familiar with, school meal programs. Now, unlike WIC, SNAP does not regulate the foods that can be purchased with SNAP dollars. So should it? I mean, should we put, regulations on that? Some studies have shown that SNAP purchases include a higher proportion of sugar-sweetened beverages, red and processed meats, convenience foods, things like that. So this is somewhat polarizing, I think, because first of all, how do you define unhealthy foods? That's going to be debatable. I mean, I may have my definitions and you may have slightly different ones. And also you have to think about the dignity of recipients. I mean, put yourself in that position, and do you want to be told, no, you can't buy that, or you can only buy this? It's something that's important to consider. There's also strategies that to increase purchasing power for healthy foods and reduce affordability of unhealthy foods. So should those be implemented? And they have been implemented to some degree in some places, but should those be more prevalent? Should we just really have try to manipulate prices of foods, healthy and unhealthy foods, to affect the consumption of those foods? Public policy changes, they target socioeconomic factors and they require the least individual effort. So in that respect, it's probably a good thing. Hopefully, if they're implemented correctly, they increase the likelihood that the easiest choice is also the healthiest choice. So those could be the nutrition environment, such as the availability of supermarkets, the affordability of healthy foods, and that could be through subsidies and taxes on healthy and unhealthy foods, respectively. We can certainly influence the food environment in public places like schools, which has been done, removing certain vending machines or putting healthier foods in vending machines. The marketing of foods, the standards for advertising, and improved and expanded food labeling. Community and organizational programs, I'm certainly a big proponent of. I think organizations that actually get into the community and through farmers markets, whatever, try to increase the availability of healthy food, increase food literacy, and just nutrition knowledge in general are great things. Expanded food and nutrition education program. It's the first US education program targeted at low-income populations. And it has the goal of using education to support self-sufficiency, nutritional health, and well-being. So again, education is such an important component of this. I'm always a big proponent of, even when it comes to diet, I don't want to ever tell people this is what you have to eat or must eat. I think we should educate people, and then hopefully they can make the best decisions for their health based on being educated. SNAP education is another federally funded nutrition education program, and it uses community and public health approaches to provide, again, educational programs, which I think are what we should be doing. And then finally, cultural factors. I think we should suggest dietary modifications that are healthy improvements while respecting cultural preferences. So such changes are possible, but they may require some real homework. You may really have to sit down with someone. I think dietitians are well equipped for this, to say, well, somebody says, well, I really like to eat this food. I know it's not that healthy. To talk about, well, what changes can be made to make it healthier and still not losing that, the cultural aspect of it. I think it's possible, but it takes some work. It's not easy. If you don't consider those cultural preferences, you'll certainly face resistance, and probably any changes that occur are probably not going to be sustained. And we also know, just in general, dietary changes that are gradual are more likely to be sustained. So instead of going in and telling someone, throwing away everything in the refrigerator and making these big wholesale changes, it's much better to make gradual changes. Cut down, instead of having 4 or 5, 6 sugar sweetened beverages a day, which is not all that uncommon. Let's for the first couple of months, let's cut down to half of that, 3 a day. let's not eat meat at every meal. Let's cut it down to maybe one meal a day. Things like that, gradual changes. And most of all, avoid the "we are the experts and we know what's best for you" attitude. Is there any quicker way to immediately turn someone off than to just go in somewhere in a community or wherever with that kind of attitude? I wouldn't like it, and I'm sure other people don't either. So I think it's important to remember that. So in summary, we need so I presented an analysis that I think is a specific analysis that's shown a particular dietary pattern that we know is not healthy. And I've hoped that I've kind of gone beyond that to consider some other factors that are important as far as actually translating that into dietary changes. So I've talked about some barriers, what keeps us from doing that, and some things that may help us to do that. And we do need a multifaceted approach that addresses the social determinants of diet quality, including confronting some of these barriers that I've mentioned, especially in under-resourced populations. And we need to address barriers to healthy diet at multiple levels. This is not just on the individual. It should not be. Government policy changes, community environment, which again, I think is very important, sociocultural factors, and the individual does bear some responsibility, but again, that's just one part of this whole thing, not the whole picture. So I think that's the end. I'm sorry I probably didn't leave quite enough time for questions, but I'm happy to. I'm going to stop this share for. Hopefully, left a few minutes for some questions, and maybe not just questions, but also some comments. I'd like to hear comments to anything that piqued your interest, or anything you might not have agreed with, or people's experiences with these kind of things. So, but thanks for your attention. And I'm going to look at the chat here. So let's see, what do you see as a major barrier to the Southern diet? So, so do you mean a barrier to kind of moving away from that a little bit into healthier dietary patterns?
Yes, that's the idea. What do you see as a major barrier?
Yeah.
Because we talked a lot about the Southern diet and its implication for chronic diseases, and especially as you talked about, heart disease. So what do we see? And you mentioned about it's difficult to change the way someone eat, but then how do we approach it so they don't feel insulted? How can we make an impact? And I'm serious about that, Dr.
No, I know.
Because we have been doing these studies.
I know.
We have seen and it seemed like we are still having studies after study, but we are not able to make that impact as it, relates to. So how do we do it? What do we do?
I don't know. I'll be perfectly honest. It's frustrating. I think, again, I think I mentioned this, maybe I talked about some of these things after your question, but I think, to me, we need to move away from, it's important, I suppose, to have your practitioner, your doctor, whatever, talk about these things. But I've found since I've been here that people that actually go into the community, get people involved, whether it's through starting a farmer's market, actually a community garden, things where people go into the community and stay in the community. Another problem we've had in the past is we do these studies where, we fly in, we do all this stuff for a year or two, and then we leave. And it's not sustainable. So we need community efforts that are sustainable. And education, I just can't emphasize that enough. And I still don't think we're doing a good enough job with that. But specifically, as far as the Southern diet, what is it about that? It's good. I mean, I don't enjoy, I'll eat an occasional something that's fried, but there's a lot of parts of that diet I'm not that thrilled about. But a lot of people grew up eating that type of a diet, and it tastes good, and it's hard to get people to make changes. I mean, getting people to make dietary changes is very challenging. I know I don't have to tell you that, but it is. So I don't have any, I wish I could tell you I have all the answers. If I did, I would, I would certainly share them, and we wouldn't be in the bad situation that we're in. So I don't have a lot of other answers except, again, the community aspect I think is very important. The education aspect is important. We need to take, and I'm not sure, you may have more experience I do with some of the programs that I mentioned, the government programs. I don't know how helpful they've always been, or if we've taken advantage of them to the degree that we should have. But I mean, I certainly think that we should. But beyond that, yeah, it's difficult. It really is. But I just think, I think a lot of it also, and again, I don't want to, I think it's tough. I don't know what to do about the changing people's perceptions about what health is. And again, I've noticed that a lot when it comes to, body image, body size. And, I walk this fine line because I don't want to offend anybody and I don't want people to feel bullied. But if we get too comfortable with, that larger body size is okay, then I don't know how we're ever going to get past that. That's going to be really problematic. So I think a lot of it, and again, it still depends on education. And it was a good point you made. We've tried this and that to educate people. We haven't necessarily been very successful, but I just don't think we can give up. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts, let's see what my thought is. I have a lot. Okay, so let's see.
And
I'm thinking that, go ahead, Dr. Fatima.
I'm sorry, it is 6:30. I know this discussion is wonderful, and I am sorry that, as you see in the chat box, we have a lot of questions and comments. But I don't think we have time. It's past 6:30, unfortunately. So if it is okay with you, Dr. Dawkins, I'm going to turn the program to Dr. Alexandra for closing the presentation and the seminar. Maybe
I'm sorry.
There's two questions in the chat though that need to be answered. One is about the alcohol and the other is about what. So I think those answers need to be addressed before we close. One says, why was alcohol and
that just
in the same category?
There just happened to be, through the factor analysis, there was a pattern where there was high loadings for those factors in one pattern. I can't say why, but that's just the way the data fell. When we looked at the eigenvalues in the scree plot, there was just a pattern that happened to have those foods that loaded heavily. So that's about all I can say. Again, these are not patterns that we sat down and said, this is going to be a pattern. These are how the data fell out. And the other one, what do you think?
It says, what do you think has the greatest influence on diet, the economic or the cultural factors?
Wow, I think that entirely depends on where you are and what you're, in many cases, I think it's economic. I really do. What's where can you get food the cheapest and fastest, and which probably is going to be generally unhealthy. In more affluent parts of the society, whatever, where money's not as much of an issue, I think it's going to be more cultural, what you're used to, what you were raised eating. Just my example, I was fortunate that money wasn't a huge issue growing up. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we could pretty much have what we wanted. But so it just depended on what my mom cooked for us, and I just grew up eating a certain way, and so it really does depend. They're both very important factors, And for those who are primarily affected by the economic factors, yeah, we need to intervene there through some of the measures that I mentioned.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
And
Shikany.
can I add one more quick thing? I'm happy to
Dr.
answer any other questions through my email. Always respond. I will not ignore emails. So I don't know if my slides will be shared or whatever, but I'm happy to.
Actually, that was one of the questions. Can we put your slides on our web page?
I will send
Southern
them.
University.
I
Thank
have
you.
no problem with if you want to.
Yes,
post those.
please.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Dr. Alexandra?
All right. Well, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Dr. Shikany. As an intervention scientist, like I said, I really enjoyed listening to your presentation and really thinking about how we can move the needle forward as it relates to just overall behavior change from a diet-related perspective. In addition to bringing up the conversation about when we think about body positivity and being supportive in that, but also understanding the overall health implications that can potentially lead to. So thank you again so much for your presentation. And on behalf of the Center of Excellence, we thank you all for your attendance. We hope you have a safe and wonderful holiday season with your friends and families, and be on the lookout for our next symposium. So make sure you go to our website. I can drop it in the chat really quickly just so you can be aware of what's going on with our center, and you can continue to engage with us. So thank you again, Dr. Shikany, and thank you for everyone who was able to attend this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shikany.
Thank you.
Bye.
Dr.
Bye-bye.
Shikany.
Have a
Bye.
great evening.